Joseph Pabon. Eridania Rodriguez clocked in for her overnight cleaning shift on a warm July evening, pushed her cart toward the elevators of a lower Manhattan office tower, and was caught on a lobby camera doing it. That grainy footage turned out to be the last time anyone would ever see her alive. For 4 days, her family searched, and detectives pulled the building apart floor by floor and found nothing. Then someone finally climbed up to open a metal air duct on the 12th floor, and the search for a missing cleaning lady became a murder investigation. Eridania Rodriguez was 46 years old. She was a wife, a mother of 3, and a grandmother who had come to New York from the Dominican Republic and built a quiet life around her family. At night, she cleaned offices inside a tower at 2 Rector Street, just steps from where the Twin Towers once stood. On July 7, 2009, she went to work like any other night and never came home. The building where she worked was supposed to be one of the safest places she spent her time. Cameras covered nearly every hallway and elevator bank. A little after 7 in the evening, those cameras recorded her steering her cart into the freight elevator, the same elevator run by a 25-year-old building employee named Joseph Pabon. And then, for a stretch of about 42 minutes, Pabon simply dropped off the camera coverage entirely. When he reappeared, he had a shirt wrapped around his neck. Not long after, he told a supervisor his stomach was bothering him and went home for the night. Eridania, by then, had vanished. Her cart sat abandoned. Her family arrived at the tower in a panic, and a search began that would stretch across 4 agonizing days, with police and cadaver dogs working the building one level at a time. On July 11th, they found her on the 12th floor, bound and gagged with industrial duct tape and folded into an air duct. The medical examiner determined she had died of homicidal asphyxiation and that she had been alive when she was sealed inside. She was still breathing when she was hidden. Stranger still, a small gold crucifix had been pressed to her face. Investigators did not have to look far for a suspect. Pabon's DNA was recovered from under Eridania's fingernails, the kind of evidence that only ends up there during a struggle. He had fresh scratch marks on his neck and body. The 42-minute gap in the footage, the shirt around his neck, the sudden illness, all of it pointed in one direction. There was one detail prosecutors kept returning to, the one that explained how the case held together. She had fought him, and her own hands had collected the proof. At trial, the assistant district attorney told the jury that Pabon was a despicable, soulless human being, and that the evidence crushingly proved his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. On April 2, 2012, the jury convicted him of second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. At his sentencing that June, the Manhattan district attorney said Pabon had senselessly and brutally murdered Eridania and then discarded her body as if it were trash. Her sister, Denise Figueroa, said it was Pabon's turn to suffer now, and that you could not call a person like that a human being because he was an animal. Eridania's daughter said her mother's horrible, disgusting death haunted her every day. Through all of it, Pabon said nothing. He has never offered a motive, and to this day no one knows why he did it. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. There was also a quieter detail that emerged in the reporting, one that suggested this was not the first time a woman around him had felt unsafe. His first wife described a man with serious anger issues, and while he sat in jail awaiting trial, he was recorded on Rikers Island phone calls making repeated violent threats toward his then-wife. His appeals have failed. He will not even be eligible for parole until July 12, 2034, and he is serving his time at Sing Sing. Pabon hid Eridania Rodriguez 4 floors above a busy lobby, and within days, investigators found her. The man in the next case was far more careful than that. He made sure his wife's body would never be found at all, and for 15 years, it worked. Robert Birnbaum. A young woman walked into her Upper East Side apartment one summer afternoon and was never seen or heard from again. She left behind no body, no crime scene, and not a single witness. Her husband told everyone she had stormed out after an argument and disappeared into the city. And for a while, that was the only version of the story anyone had. What almost nobody knew at the time was that her husband was a licensed pilot, that he had taken a small plane up over the Atlantic that very day, and that the reason she would never be found was that there was nothing left on land to find. Gail Katz Birnbaum was 29 years old. She was bright, ambitious, and working toward a doctorate in clinical psychology. She was married to Robert Birnbaum, a successful Manhattan plastic surgeon, and from the outside they looked like a couple with everything ahead of them. By the summer of 1985, she had reportedly decided to ask him for a divorce. On July 7, 1985, Gail vanished from their apartment on East 85th Street. Birnbaum waited roughly 30 hours before he reported her missing, and when he finally did, he left out one significant piece of his day. He had driven to an airport in New Jersey, rented a small Cessna, and flown out over the ocean. Prosecutors would later argue that he strangled Gail in their apartment, loaded her body into the plane, and dropped it into the Atlantic somewhere between Long Island and the New Jersey shore. Her body was never recovered. What made the case so disturbing was that the warning signs had been screaming for years. 2 years earlier, Birnbaum had choked Gail into unconsciousness during an argument over a cigarette. He had allegedly tried to drown her cat. 3 separate psychiatrists had concluded she was in genuine danger, and one therapist had gone so far as to put it in writing, advising the couple to separate for Gail's own safety. People around her saw exactly where this was heading, and they said so. And somehow it gets worse, because Gail apparently knew it too, and was planning to leave the very weekend she disappeared. For more than a decade, Birnbaum was a free man. The problem for investigators was that they had no body, no forensics, and no eyewitness. Everything they had was circumstantial. It was not until December of 1999 that he was finally charged, and the trial that followed in the fall of 2000 was built entirely on inference and timeline. The lead prosecutor later admitted it was the toughest case he had ever tried, with no forensics and no eyewitnesses, nothing but circumstance. The jury didn't need long. After about 5.5 hours, they convicted Robert Birnbaum of second-degree murder. The judge who sentenced him said the evidence had made it absolutely, overwhelmingly clear that he had killed his wife, and she handed down the maximum, 20 years to life. Gail's sister said she sat in the courtroom in shock and then felt something like relief. The surgeon surrendered his New York medical license. New Jersey revoked his as well, and every appeal he filed went nowhere. For 2 decades, he insisted he was innocent. Then, at a parole hearing in December of 2020, with his eligibility finally arrived, he said the thing his wife's family had waited 35 years to hear. He admitted he had attacked her because he wanted her to stop yelling at him. He admitted he had strangled her. And he admitted that afterward he had gone flying, opened the door of the plane, and put her body out over the ocean. The prosecutor who convicted him said he was stunned, that he had always believed that day would never come. Parole was denied. Birnbaum, now an old man, described his younger self only as immature, and he remains behind bars. Birnbaum was a surgeon in his 40s who hid the truth for 15 years and confessed only when he had no reason left to lie. The killer in the next case was the opposite in almost every way. He was 16 years old, and he barely tried to hide anything at all. John Catehiss. A veteran New York radio reporter, a familiar voice to anyone who listened to the morning news, was found dead in his own Brooklyn apartment, with the water still running in the tub and the sink. Whoever had done it had left the taps open, apparently trying to wash the place down before walking out. When police pieced together the reporter's final hours, the trail led them to a Craigslist ad and to a suspect almost nobody could believe. The person who had killed him was 16 years old. 16. That's not a typo, by the way. George Weber was 47 years old. He was a freelance reporter for ABC News Radio and a former on-air personality at WABC, where he had shared a morning show with Curtis Sliwa and Ron Kuby. He lived alone in the Carroll Gardens neighborhood of Brooklyn. He was, by every account, a working journalist who had spent his life around microphones and deadlines. In March of 2009, Weber posted on Craigslist, and a teenager named John Catehiss answered. The two arranged to meet at Weber's apartment, with the teenager expecting to be paid. On March 20th, Catehiss came to the apartment on Henry Street. What happened inside ended with Weber dead, stabbed dozens of times, and bound at the ankles with duct tape. His body was discovered 2 days later, on March 22nd, after the running water and his sudden silence raised alarms. Within days, on March 25th, police arrested Catehiss in the East Elmhurst section of Queens. From the start, the teenager unsettled the people tasked with questioning him. Detectives noted that he smiled and even winked during his interrogation. When he eventually appeared in court, he showed up with what observers described as satanic scribbling marked on his shoes. The prosecutor who tried the case did not describe him as a confused or frightened kid. She called him mature and a cold, calculating, savvy killer, and she argued that his age was the least relevant thing about him. His defense was that he had acted in self-defense after an encounter that turned violent. The first jury could not agree, and the case ended in a mistrial. Prosecutors tried him again, and in November of 2011, the second jury convicted John Catehiss of second-degree murder. He was charged and tried as an adult, despite being a minor when the killing happened. On December 13, 2011, the judge sentenced him to 25 years to life, the maximum available. Before the sentence came down, Catehiss told the court that he was sorry for the death of George Weber and that he regretted it. Among the most striking moments came from Weber's own family. His brother-in-law stood up and told the teenager that he forgave him and that he carried no hatred. It was a measure of grace in a case that had offered almost none. Catehiss is serving his sentence at Sing Sing, and under the terms of that sentence, he will not be eligible for release for decades. Catehiss at least knew the name of the man he killed, and he came to that apartment for a reason, however twisted. The victim in the next case was a complete stranger to his killer. He was a young man riding in the back seat of a cab, stopped at a red light, who had the misfortune of being in the wrong car at the wrong moment. Michael Magnan. A brother and sister climbed into a livery cab in Brooklyn in the early hours of a Saturday morning, heading home like thousands of other people do on a weekend night. At a red light, a stranger walked up to the car and tried to rob the driver. The driver refused, fought back, and sped off. And in the space of a few furious seconds, a robbery that the gunman had already lost turned into a killing, and a 23-year-old in the back seat who had done absolutely nothing was struck and would not survive. Nikita Grabelski was 23 years old and lived in Forest Hills, Queens. On the night he died, he was riding with his sister, both of them passengers in the cab. He was not a target. He was not involved in anything. He was simply a young man on his way home who happened to be sitting behind the driver when everything went wrong. In the early morning of August 18, 2012, the cab stopped at a light near Utica Avenue and Avenue M in Flatlands, Brooklyn. A 19-year-old named Michael Magnan approached and demanded cash. The driver, Eric Martin, refused, punched Magnan in the face, and hit the gas. As the car pulled away, Magnan opened fire into it. One of the rounds struck Grabelski in the head, and he was later pronounced brain dead at Kings County Hospital. Magnan, who already had a string of prior arrests behind him at 19, did not get far. About 20 minutes later, he tried to rob and pistol whip a bouncer outside a nearby club, and that club's security guards trailed him to a house and flagged down police. The evidence against him stacked up quickly. A shell casing matching the fatal shot was found inside his own sneaker. The gun was recovered near where he was arrested, and it carried his DNA. Both the cab driver and a second man he had menaced that night identified him. A jury in Kings County convicted him of second-degree murder, first-degree manslaughter, first-degree attempted robbery, and menacing, with the judgment entered on July 1, 2014. There is one genuinely strange wrinkle in this case, and no, I'm not making that up. The prosecutor who had tried the entire case, a veteran of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, failed to show up to deliver his own closing argument on May 5, 2014. He had been hospitalized about 40 miles away, recovering from a bout with alcohol, and he left the office after 27 years, not long after. The jury convicted Magnan anyway. The conviction was later affirmed on appeal in June of 2019, with the higher court finding that the sentence imposed was not excessive. The exact length of that sentence is not something I'll put a precise number on, because the public record doesn't clearly state it. But corrections records list him serving a lengthy term, and he is held at Sing Sing. At the time of his arrest, Magnan insisted to reporters that he had not shot anybody. His own family struggled to square the young man they knew with what had happened. His father said his son had been drunk and could not understand how he could do something like that. And an aunt insisted he was a beautiful person, not a maniac, not a psycho. Whatever he was to the people who loved him, a jury decided what he was to Nikita Grabelski, and the answer was final. If these cases are pulling you in and you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time to fix that. It genuinely helps the channel grow and makes sure the next one finds you. Frederick Charles Wood. A man stood in a courtroom, listened to a judge sentence him to die in the electric chair, and then thanked him for it. He told the court he wanted to ride the lightning, and the sooner they got on with it, the better. He was not bluffing, and he was not insane. Frederick Charles Wood genuinely wanted to die in that chair because he had spent most of his life killing people, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Wood was born in October of 1911 in Elmira, New York, and over the course of his life, he claimed 5 victims spread across more than 3 decades. He said his first killing came when he was still a teenager himself, a young woman he knew. In 1933, he beat and stabbed a woman named Pearl Robinson, leaving her with more than 100 wounds. And in 1942, he killed a man named John Lohman, the crime that finally put him behind bars. At that trial, the judge said something that should have settled Wood's future for good. He stated plainly that, for the protection of society, Wood should never be released from prison. Wood was given 20 years to life. It should have been the end of him as a free man. It wasn't. In June of 1960, after serving about 17 years, Wood was paroled. Law enforcement in Elmira objected. Prosecutors objected. Judges objected. They were overruled, and Wood was released on the condition that he relocate to Albany and stay out of trouble. And somehow, it gets worse. Within weeks, Wood broke his parole, traveled to New York City and walked into an apartment in the Astoria section of Queens. There he killed two elderly men, a 62-year-old World War I veteran named John Resigno and Resigno's roommate, a man in his late 70s named Frederick Sess. Then he did something that even hardened detectives found chilling. He left taunting notes behind. One of them asked, in effect, how the readers liked these two murders. Another openly mocked the parole board that had set him free. When he was caught and tried for the two killings, the jury needed less than 75 minutes to convict him on both counts of first-degree murder. In December of 1961, the judge sentenced him to death. Wood, by various accounts, giggled and laughed through the proceedings, and he thanked the judge for prescribing him the shock treatment. On the stand, he had insisted he was perfectly sane, that he simply loved killing, and that he welcomed his execution. He waved off 3 separate stays that could have delayed it. He did not want more time. He wanted the chair. On March 21, 1963, he got it. Frederick Charles Wood was electrocuted at Sing Sing, and before the current was switched on, he reportedly told the witnesses gathered to watch that this was an educational project, that they were about to see what electricity does to a man named Wood, and that they should enjoy themselves. It was the second-to-last execution New York State would ever carry out. Wood was the next-to-last man New York ever put to death in that chair. The man who followed him into it, just months later, would be the very last, and his name would mark the quiet end of the death penalty in the state for good. Eddie Lee Mays. On a summer night in 1963, a man was strapped into the electric chair at Sing Sing, and when the current finally stopped, something larger stopped with it. New York State never executed anyone again. Eddie Lee Mays was the last of nearly 700 people the state had put to death, and the last man to die in that infamous chair. So who was he? And why did the machinery of execution go silent right after him? Mays was born in March of 1929 in North Carolina, and by the time of his crime, he was a man with a long and violent record behind him, including a manslaughter conviction in his home state and a history of assaults. On the night of March 23, 1961, he and 2 accomplices walked into a bar and grill in the East Harlem neighborhood of Manhattan and announced a robbery. A 31-year-old patron named Maria Marini was slow to hand over her belongings, and when her purse turned out to be empty, Mays put a revolver to her forehead and killed her. The gang fled with a grand total of $275. What came out at trial was the scale of what these men had been doing. In the span of just 6 weeks, the gang had pulled off 52 separate robberies across the city. You'd think someone would have said something, that a spree like that would have been stopped long before it reached Maria Marini. Nobody did. Mays was convicted of first-degree felony murder in 1962. The jury deliberated about 90 minutes on his guilt, and then roughly 20 minutes more before declining to recommend mercy, which under the law at the time made a death sentence mandatory. He had been offered a way out. Prosecutors had floated a plea to a lesser charge that would have spared his life and left him in prison. He turned it down flat, saying he would rather die in the chair than spend the rest of his life behind bars. The decision now rested with the governor. Nelson Rockefeller reviewed the case and denied clemency, pointing to the cold deliberation of the killing and to the fact that Mays had already taken a life once before. There would be no reprieve. Mays declined to make a final statement. He was brought into the death chamber at 10:01 at night, and he was pronounced dead 3 minutes later, on August 15, 1963. He didn't know it, and neither did the men who threw the switch, but Eddie Lee Mays would be the end of the line. New York would never use its electric chair again, and the era of state executions there closed quietly behind him. Mays died in 1963, in a time when New York still answered its worst crimes with the chair. The man in the next case committed his crime decades later, and it was the kind of crime that made even a long prison sentence feel, to a lot of people, like nowhere near enough. Robert John Cronin. On the surface, Robert Cronin looked like an ordinary family man. He had a fiancée, several children, a steady job driving for a rideshare company, and a background check that had come back clean. That was the version of him the world could see. The version that surfaced in late 2018 was something else entirely. And by the time it was over, a judge would say he hoped the record left no doubt that everyone involved believed this man should be locked away permanently. Cronin's crime came to light on November 15, 2018, in Niskayuna, New York, through a mandated child abuse hotline. An 11-year-old girl had been found to be pregnant. What investigators uncovered was a predatory sexual assault against a child, and DNA testing confirmed that Cronin, then 33 years old, was the father. He was arrested in January of the following year. His response to the evidence was bizarre. Before the DNA results were in, Cronin actually floated a defense claiming the pregnancy had happened through contact with a sock rather than through any assault. And no, I'm not making that up. He abandoned that story entirely once he understood that the DNA would establish his paternity beyond any argument. Prosecutors in Schenectady County indicted him on predatory sexual assault against a child, a top-level felony carrying the possibility of 25 years to life, along with first-degree perjury and a misdemeanor child endangerment charge. In August of 2019, rather than force the young victim to relive any of it on a witness stand, Cronin pleaded guilty to rape and to perjury. The plea spared the child a trial. On October 10, 2019, he was sentenced to 24 years in prison, followed by 20 years of post-release supervision, with a concurrent term for the perjury. The assistant district attorney did not mince words. He pointed out that an 11-year-old child had given birth because of Cronin's selfishness, and that Cronin's complaint, remarkably, was about the freedoms he would lose, down to no longer being able to go to malls. The judge told him directly that he hoped the record was abundantly clear that everyone believed he should be incarcerated permanently. Through all of it, including the victim's own statement, Cronin reportedly showed no emotion at all. He is serving his sentence within the New York prison system, listed among the inmates held at Sing Sing. The 7 men before him are remembered for what they took from other people. The final name on this list is here for nearly the opposite reason, because his story is about a man who walked into Sing Sing as one thing and walked out as something almost no one could have predicted. Clarence McLean. He was once described as one of the most feared men inside Sing Sing, a self-described yard bandit who moved through the prison's pecking order through sheer intimidation. Years later, that same man stood on a red carpet as an award-nominated actor. His name read aloud beside some of the biggest names in Hollywood. So how does a person travel that far? From running a prison yard to earning an Academy Award nomination, all of it set in motion inside the walls of a maximum security facility. Clarence McLean was born in November of 1966 and raised from around the age of 5 in Mount Vernon, New York. In the mid-1990s, when he was in his late 20s, he was convicted of robbery and sentenced to 17 years. He was sent to Sing Sing, and by his own account, he arrived as a man who sold drugs and solved his problems with fear. About 6 years into his sentence, something shifted. Macklin came across a performance being staged inside the prison chapel by a program called Rehabilitation Through the Arts, which had been founded at Sing Sing in 1996. He joined it. The man who had been one of the most feared figures in the yard started out as a stagehand, then worked his way up to stage manager. And somewhere along the way, he developed a deep and genuine love for Shakespeare. He appeared in a documentary about the program in 2015, and he earned a degree in behavioral science while still incarcerated. He would later say that there were stretches of his life he would never want anyone else to follow, that the way he used to think had failed him, and that it made him wonder how many other people it had failed too. Of the arts program, he said that he had stopped thinking of himself as a man in prison at all. He said he felt free. Macklin was released in 2012. On the outside, he became a youth counselor working with at-risk kids, an ambassador for the same arts program that had changed his life, and a motivational speaker. He carried a simple message, that people still have the ability to change and grow and contribute something, but that sometimes they need someone willing to nurture that possibility. Then came the part almost no one saw coming. In 2023, a film called Sing Sing premiered, telling the story of that prison arts program, and Macklin did not just consult on it. He played a version of himself on screen, acting opposite Coleman Domingo, and he helped develop and write the story itself. His performance earned him Best Supporting Actor nominations from the BAFTAs, the Critics' Choice Awards, and the Independent Spirit Awards, and a win at the Gotham Awards. And when the film earned a nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay, Macklin and his collaborator became, according to the program that had shaped him, the first alumni of Rehabilitation Through the Arts ever nominated for an Academy Award. Today, Clarence Macklin is a working actor and an advocate. The man once called one of the most feared in Sing Sing now spends his time trying to convince young people that the worst thing they have ever done does not have to be the last thing they ever become. 8 men, 1 prison, and 8 very different roads to the same set of walls. If a story like this stays with you, thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.